One thing I'll start off by sharing is that the digital LSAT is coming this year. LSAC is in a transition period. So if you haven't heard, if you're taking it in March or June, you're totally fine. It's paper and pencil format as always. Starting with the July LSAT, half of test takers will be given the digital format, half will be given the paper and pencil format. And LSAC chooses for you. You don't get any advance notice. So I don't know about you, but I would not want to be in a situation like that. And so I recommend, if at all possible, avoiding the July LSAT when there's going to be this ambiguity around that. If you can, go for March or June to be guaranteed paper and pencil, or go for September and beyond, so at least you know you're definitely getting the digital format in advance and you can prepare accordingly. I'm honestly not a huge fan of the digital format as it currently exists. I think the touchscreen interface is a bit clunky. For example, you can't actually draw on the tablet itself freehand like you can on a paper version of the exam. So this affects how you take the entire exam, including logical reasoning. If your LSAT prep method so far involves writing or taking notes on the page on the question itself, know that with the digital LSAT, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to get scrap paper, of course, but it's not the same thing. So I'd recommend, if you can, avoid it. If not, of course, there will be ways to deal with it. And LSAC recently put a tool on their website. They're calling it an online familiarization tool for the digital LSAT. If you go to familiar.lsac.org, you can play around with the interface and see for yourself on either cell phone, tablet, or computer. But I actually am recommending that if you're taking the digital LSAT, get a tablet to practice on so that you are preparing with as close to the real thing as you possibly can. LSAC is using a Microsoft Surface Go tablet, but you can use any other tablet as well. The Samsung Galaxy might be a more affordable option if you want to simulate that. One other thing you should know about the LSAT changes coming this year is that the June LSAT, you won't be doing the writing sample in the test center. That's the first time ever that LSAC is going to let you do the writing sample at home on your own computer. They'll monitor you with a webcam and a microphone, and you can do it anytime for up to, I think, several months or a year after you are scheduled to take an LSAT test, and you only have to do it once. I've spoken with some admission officers about this recently on my YouTube channel and podcast, and they were basically saying that they don't read the writing sample. They probably still wouldn't read it moving forward, but there could be a slightly higher chance of reading it because it's more legible, since it'll be typed out rather than written by hand. And as always, take the writing sample seriously. So that's all for recent changes. Now we can talk a bit about logical reasoning. The LSAT logical reasoning section, the questions are presented in a general order of difficulty. Not a perfect order of difficulty, but a general order. And that means that you want to spend less time than average on the easier questions, so you'll have more time to devote to the tougher questions that come later in the section. So I recommend for those aiming for 160, 165 plus, to do the first 10 questions in something like 10 to 12 minutes. That way you build up a time bank you can apply to the tougher questions later in the section. And it's perfectly normal and natural to find a handful of questions, maybe more than a handful, but at least 3 to 5 questions that you can't make headway on, you're stuck on. They might be in the late teens or early 20s within the logical reasoning section of 25, 26 questions total. And I'd recommend flagging those or marking them off in some way and coming back to them later. In fact, the digital LSAT, one cool thing about it is that it lets you flag questions within the app. So you'll automatically see which ones you want to go back to. But it's totally okay to do this. Even I myself, and I scored a 175, I'll still flag 3 to 5 questions to come back to at the end of the section. Why do I do this? Because I don't want to get bogged down in the moment and get stuck in a kind of LSAT quicksand where I'm investing minute after minute, but my comprehension, my understanding is not improving. These questions can be a time suck that unfortunately prevent you from moving forward, and you might miss 3 questions because you were working on one question that your odds were fairly low on anyway. So I'd recommend cut your losses, move on, come back later. The nice thing about this as well is that the second look gives you a fresh perspective. You can break out of tunnel vision in order to see the question in a new light. Maybe something that made the question tougher initially ends up being less confusing on a second pass. But anything that gives you trouble, it could be parallel reasoning questions that are overly wordy. It could be sciencey questions if you're more of a pre-law humanities type person, or anything at all, really. If there's a parallel question in the first 10 questions, I'll typically do it in the moment, because although parallel questions might be more wordy, the method of reasoning is not necessarily any more complex. And so I would handle those in the moment. But tough questions, especially those with abstract formal language, it's totally normal for those to give you trouble in the moment. Come back later. Now you might ask, well, how should I handle abstract language, formal language? How can I deal with this and better understand it? The way to deal with it is to invest the time now, early in your prep, to thoroughly understand that language and those phrases, so that when you come across them on test day, you won't be seeing them for the first time and you'll already know what they mean. It's normal to not know now, but you can study this, you can prepare for this. And I don't see a lot of LSAT books recommending this. Maybe there's too many words or phrases to define. But as an exercise, what you can do is any tough question with wording you don't understand, especially formal logic wording like antecedent, consequent, confusing, necessary for sufficient, things of that nature, you can learn those now. As an exercise, I actually recommend that my students do something like 24 or 50 questions in a row, just defining abstract language. You can pick these out from the old LSAT exams and just do a bunch at once as an exercise, as a drill. Define all those phrases for yourself that are typically describing some abstract classic method of reasoning or classic logical fallacy, and learn them now so that when you come across them in the future, you're not wasting time trying to figure out in the moment. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel on test day. You can learn this now so that you always have it in your wheelhouse to pull out when you need to. Now, we spoke about order of approach. First 10 questions, 10 to 12 minutes, more than the average amount of time per question for the tougher ones that come later. You build up a time bank, 3 to 5 minutes. You go back and handle those 3 to 5 tough questions and give them a second pass. Now, how does this differ from games and reading comp? Quite a bit, actually. Games and reading comp are grouped by game or by passage, and so the approach here would be a little bit different. The order of difficulty is not quite as clear in these sections, but just to be comprehensive, I will touch on them briefly. For games, do the first question, typically the orientation question, do that first. Then do all local if questions, and finally the global questions, like the general ones. That way you build your understanding as you go. The orientation questions, those are the ones asking which one of the following is a possible ordering or possible grouping depending on the game type. For if local questions, those will be the ones that say something like, if A is on slot 3, what must be true? Or if the letter X is in, what must be true or what could be true, etc. And finally, the global questions, those are the general, what must be true, what could be true, what cannot be true. So you build your understanding as you go with building the scenarios, with the hypotheticals in the local questions, and you save the global ones for last. In reading comprehension, slightly different. For those questions, I would do the main idea, primary purpose, and passage organization questions first. Anything general or global in nature. Then do the local line reference questions, because they're giving you a jumping off point. And then finally do the more inferential questions that require reading between the lines, as well as the ones that are asking you something more abstract that's similar to logical reasoning questions, like a parallel or strengthen or weaken, even within reading comp. So that's a bit about order of approach. Now, we could also talk about common mistakes that students typically make on logical reasoning. One of the biggest mistakes I see is failing to distinguish between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. This is really important. A lot of prep books will lump them together under the catch-all category of assumption, but this is a mistake because these question types are asking for very different things. Necessary assumption questions are asking you for something that must be true. And so I would treat those like a general inference question, actually. They're not properly viewed as strengtheners because the necessary assumption is something that needs to be the case in order for the argument to work. It's not new information. And so for that reason, anything that needs to be the case is already given by the stimulus. So if we assume that the stimulus is valid or given, all necessary assumptions will logically follow. That must be the case. And so, for example, if someone is making the argument that God created the world, then it must be the case implicit in that statement that there is or was a God at some point. That is necessary to assume in order for the argument to be true. On the flip side, sufficient assumption questions are asking for something very different. They're asking for something that, if true, would guarantee the argument 100%, but that sufficient assumption doesn't necessarily have to be true. So for example, if I wanted to buy a $1 item, it would be sufficient to have a $100 bill, but it is not required in order to buy a $1 item. Having $1 or $5 or $10 would be perfectly fine and sufficient as well. Now, how do we tell the difference between these question types? It's based on the question stem, in particular, a word or phrase in the question stem. Necessary assumption questions will have words and phrases that are synonymous with necessity, like depends upon, requires, or assumes. Sufficient assumption questions, on the other hand, will have words or phrases in the question stem that are synonymous with sufficiency, like allows or enables or follows logically if assumed or properly inferred if assumed. Very important to know the difference. Can't stress this highly enough. Again, of course, I have more resources on my YouTube channel and podcast if you would like to go into more depth on those. I don't want you to, however, spend too much time thinking about questions by type. It's also important to think about methods of reasoning in the stimulus, in the argument. A lot of times students will say to me, I'm getting lots of questions wrong, but I can't spot any trends. Or they'll say, I'm getting lots of flaw questions wrong and lots of necessary assumption questions wrong. And in those cases, I'll say, well, you might be getting more of those wrong because there are more of them to get wrong. Not all questions appear in equal proportions. There are a lot of necessary assumption and flaw questions out there, and so you'll get more of them wrong just because you're doing more of them. And again, questions by type is not the only thing to think about. The method of reasoning in the stimulus could be why you're getting things wrong and why you might not notice any particular trends when you're viewing them by type. People classify by type because it's easy to do so, but it's equally, if not more important, to thoroughly understand the stimulus. And so what I want to do with you is take an argument and look at it from a number of different angles. So you'll see that thoroughly understanding the argument is really the most important thing of all. So let's say we had an argument that we should go to a particular restaurant because it has a 5-star rating on Yelp. What would strengthen that argument? One thing we could say is that if we knew that Yelp reviews were a valid indicator of a restaurant's quality, that would strengthen the argument that we should go to a restaurant because of its Yelp rating. So it strengthens the argument if we strengthen the validity of the evidence. The evidence is a given, of course, but how do we know that evidence is good? How do we know that Yelp reviews are reliable? If we learn that Yelp reviews are a good indication that they're properly filtered, that Yelp is good at spotting fake reviews, that the restaurant has a lot of reviews that are 5 stars, that would all strengthen the idea that we should go there. It would weaken the argument if we learned that the Yelp reviews are fake, or that they're from the restaurant owner's friends and family who are heavily biased. Or if we learned that there was only 1 review on Yelp, well, maybe that's not a large enough sample size. Or maybe the Yelp reviews are from people who don't have good standards for evaluating food, and so they're not good judges, so we shouldn't take the reviews seriously. And if we wanted to evaluate the argument, we would want to ask the question, well, how good an indicator are Yelp reviews? Or if we framed it slightly differently and we said that this restaurant has a 5-star rating on Yelp, yet we decided not to go there. That's a puzzling situation. We want to explain that seeming paradox. If we learned that, or if we proposed that Yelp reviews were not a reliable indicator of a restaurant's quality, then that would help to explain why we decided not to go there in the end. So lots of different angles from which to view these sorts of arguments. And so for that reason, I want you to think more critically about arguments from the perspective of the stimulus. And as an exercise, one thing you can do is you can actually take a stimulus, take a logical reasoning argument, and cover the question stem and answer choices, and instead write your own question stem and write your own answer choices for that argument. It's a great way to evaluate your understanding of the reasoning, and it also helps you play with patterns in how LSAC makes wrong answer choices tempting. One of the biggest things I learned writing LSAT explanations is how LSAC goes about creating traps, creating tempting wrong answer choices. I was speaking with a friend of mine recently who used to write actual LSAT questions, and he emphasized to me that there was a pattern in how they craft wrong answers to make them tempting. Like they might include a mistaken reversal or a mistaken negation of a given conditional statement, or they might translate unless improperly, or they might link conditional statements together improperly. And so being good at spotting those patterns is really important to avoid falling into those traps. And this is where review comes in. One of the biggest mistakes I see students make is doing lots and lots of exams without reviewing them in depth. The real value is not in doing the problems. The value is in the review process where you learn from your mistakes. So for every LSAT question you get wrong or have difficulty with, I want you to look at what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it, and what ultimately made it wrong. A lot of times the choice will be half right, but half wrong. Or there will be one little word in the answer choice that makes it wrong. And so you want to spot those patterns to avoid making those mistakes in the future. And on the flip side, you want to see what was discouraging about the right answer choice that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately made it correct. You want to do this again and again and again so that you see which traps you are uniquely prone to falling into. There might be, let's say, 1,000 traps on the LSAT, traps of encouragement towards wrong answer choices and traps of discouragement away from right answer choices. And you're not falling for all 1,000 traps, of course, or you'd be getting a 120. So you're presumably doing better than that. And so you want to see which of those particular 1,000 traps are you falling into, and save a booklet of only wrong answers, or only wrong answers, or like a running list of them, a running list of all the questions you got wrong or had difficulty with, and return to it frequently, review it, and even redo those questions. You can photocopy your LSAT exams before you complete them, and you can then reprint or photocopy again multiple copies of them so that you can redo them again and again without seeing your previous work. And through that process, you'll get better at your reasoning abilities, and you'll get better at spotting what was your wrong thinking, what was your wrong analysis, and correct it for the next time around. Anyway, we've covered quite a bit of ground today. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please subscribe to be notified of new videos as I release them, new podcasts as I release them as well, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all. I love hearing from students. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.